We're here south of Worland in the Bighorn Basin, and this is irrigated farming country, steeped in tradition. Normal precipitation here is only about 6 to 8 inches, and without irrigation from the Bighorn Basin, this entire country would look like these dry brown hills behind me. Here's our featured guest now. Hello, Lyle and Shelly. Tell me about what brought you to this place.
Well, Barton, I moved to this area about 17 years ago with a job transfer, and Shelly married me and moved up here a year later. We lived in town for a few years, and about 7 years ago we had a chance to buy this property in the country.
When you were looking to buy a place, what were some of the things you were looking for?
Well, we were looking for an acreage large enough to handle the 4 or 5 head of horses that we keep. We do enjoy our critters. This property happens to be 15 acres, which is about right. It allows us to have enough grazing and raise enough hay to support the animals that we want to have around for our enjoyment.
Well, Lyle, this is a great looking pasture. Tell me about it. How do you manage it?
We work kind of hard at it. We basically just rotate pastures. We have a pasture set up by the house here, and then another pasture back behind the barn. And we'll graze each one of these on about a 10-day to 2-week rotation, depending on the weather and the rate of grass growth and so forth. This pasture that we're in right now has been rested for about 10 days. After the horses were pulled out of it, we drug the pasture to distribute the manure. We sprayed some weeds. We bush hogged down any forage that they did not graze. There's certain species that they just don't want to graze, and so we bush hog those down to generate and stimulate some new succulent growth, and fertilized the pasture and then irrigated it pretty heavily for a couple of days. And so that resulted about 10 days later in the kind of vegetative cover that you see here. What we're trying to accomplish is to get the grass to regrow to the point where you don't see any bare dirt anywhere, that you know, that if you walk through it in the morning, your feet are going to get wet with the dew. And some of our pasture rotation timing has also has to do with how used up the other pasture is, the one that we need to come out of. If that one is showing some stress, then we might move up the pasture rotation day or two to get back and rehabilitate that other pasture. Got a lot to do with the weather.
Tell me about how you decide when it's time to bring in the horses to be grazing, and then when it's time for them to leave for a new pasture.
Well, it's time to go when you can see areas in the pasture that they have selectively grazed down, and you're starting to see dirt, bare dirt, or getting close to the dirt. At that point in time, they've gone through all of the groceries that they selected for, and they're starting to get into the less palatable grasses. And at that point in time, I would want to pull them out, put them in a fresh pasture like this, and go in and brush hog that used pasture. When we first turn them into a pasture that's been regrown for 10 days to 2 weeks, we don't just turn them loose. We turn them in for 2 or 3 hours in the evening when we get home, and then run them back in. We don't want to get too much exposure to that lush green grass and get a grass founder situation. But over the course of a couple of days, we'll extend those grazing periods, a couple of 3 days, and then they'll have free access to that pasture. We also feed dry hay while we're grazing in order to kind of bulk up their diet a little bit and help reduce the risk of a grass founder. There are times when we don't have a pasture that's really ready to graze yet, and that's the reason we build a kind of a large confinement area or a sacrifice area that we can just pen them up and feed them hay until we've got the pasture in the condition that we want it to be in to turn loose. But we do feed hay year round, feed a little bit of hay even when they're grazing, and they love to eat dry hay, and it's good for their digestive tract and helps reduce the risk of grass founder. Well, one of the things that we try hard to avoid is to turn the horses out on a wet pasture, one that's recently been irrigated. You know, a horse's hoof can create a lot of compaction on wet ground. So, you know, we try to hold them off a pasture until the irrigation is finished and the ground is dried up enough that when a horse walks across it, you don't see a hoof print impression in the ground. Sometimes that's hard to do, but we strive to keep them off of wet ground.
You told us that you use electric fence to manage your grazing and where the horses are. How do you move that electric fence? Is it easy to use?
Well, horses learn pretty quickly with 1 or 2 exposures to an electric wire, and they just leave it alone. You know, it's not abusive to them at all. They know what it is and they know where it is, and they just choose not to go there. You know, we have electric wires around the perimeter fences where there's some areas, some vegetation that we don't want them chewing on. We've got a hot wire along the top of the barbed wire fence here to keep them from reaching over and leaning on that barbed wire fence. And we string a hot wire across the pasture to control how much of the pasture they can use at any one point in time. And it's pretty low tech, really. We just move the hot wire along and tie it into the hot wire wherever we happen to be joining the permanent fence.
How is it that you go about breaking up all your manure in your corrals and in your pastures?
Well, a lot of people ask what we do with our manure. Where do we haul our manure? And we've never hauled a bucket full of manure off of this place. I bolted together a set of old tires that I got from my friend that runs a tire shop. He was glad to get rid of them. And I just drag that around the corrals behind the four-wheeler, and it kind of pulverizes the manure and it just kind of dissipates into the ground. Likewise, we've got a more aggressive drag that you see that we use on the pasture, something that'll dig down into the dirt or into the grass and distribute the manure a little bit. But this is a pretty low-tech outfit. I mean, we don't have a lot of fancy equipment.
Now, in your pasture management, you're using some fertilizer and you're using fertility tests. How do you get that fertilizer out on the ground?
Well, we use a cart from the co-op, the Bighorn Co-op, buy bulk fertilizer and distribute it across the hay field and the larger pastures. We kind of scoop some of that bulk fertilizer out and store it in the shed. And we've got a little fertilizer spreader that we pull behind a four-wheeler to put a little supplemental fertilizer on the pastures more frequently.
And how often do you fertilize and when do you do it?
Well, as we talked about, we do get a university soil test, and we follow that recommendation. And this year, I think our soil test recommended about 100 pounds of nitrogen, about 80 pounds of phosphate. We put the phosphate and a little bit of the nitrogen on in a spring application, and we hold the nitrogen, hold most of the nitrogen in 1 or 2 summer applications. After the first cutting of hay comes off, we'll put some more nitrogen on in the form of urea. And then we'll probably put another little dose of nitrogen on after the second cutting comes off. My theory is, and I don't know if there's any science behind this, but the nitrogen that gets applied in the early spring feeds a lot of the weeds that get ahead of the desirable plants we're trying to grow. And if we feel if we hold that nitrogen into the summer, we have a better chance of getting that nitrogen into the plants that we really want to grow. As a result of the fertility program and the good soils that we have, this place will produce pretty easily about 5 tons of alfalfa grass hay per acre. And we graze, we keep 5 horses usually, and we graze them on about 1.5 acres. And the rest of the property's in hay production. Of the hay that we produce, we probably feed less than 1/4 of what we produce to support those 5 horses, and the rest of the hay we partner with a neighbor that provides the machine operations and sell some of that hay, some of that surplus hay.
What kind of forage species are here on your place?
Well, we seeded in the alfalfa and in these pasture areas, we seeded a pasture mix that you can buy at the co-op. It's a mixture of brome grass and orchard grass and fescue. We also have some other grasses that basically flow in with the irrigation water. One of them is Garrison's creeping meadow foxtail that you see growing along the fence rows here. It kind of follows the water, and that's a desirable grazing plant, and it helps to spread itself, and it helps to displace some of the less desirable species like foxtail barley, which is a significant weed problem in this area. We found that wherever we can get the Garrison grass to establish itself, it kind of outcompetes the foxtail barley. And we don't have the foxtail barley problem wherever we can establish the Garrison.
How is the irrigation water delivered out to the fields?
Basically, the water is pumped out of the canal, lifted about 3 feet, and put into a gated irrigation pipe system that covers the place. There isn't any place on the property that isn't within about 200 or 300 feet of the gated pipe. And there are some areas that we couldn't get the gated pipe and gravity to work to put the water where we needed it, and we installed some sprinklers to reach some of those areas of the pasture over here.
When you're irrigating and moving water around your property, how long do you know to keep it in the same spot?
Well, we've got a couple of valves set up that we can surge the water back and forth to 2 or more different locations, and we don't want to have water standing for a long period of time. But we basically change water in the morning and change it in the evening. It takes us about a week to cover the property when we're flood irrigating, and we do that about 4 times a season, 4 times during the summer, between before first cutting and then between the hay cuttings and then irrigation in the fall if we have time and have water. But we try to minimize the amount of wastewater that goes out the bottom of the place. For one thing, it costs us money to pump the water, and another one is we don't want to use any more water than we need to produce the vegetative cover that we desire.
Now, Shelly, you've got 5 horses here. We all know horses produce a lot of manure, and one of the things about manure is it attracts a lot of flies, but there really aren't any flies around here. What are you doing to manage your fly problem?
When we moved here and we're so excited about having both a morning and an evening porch on the house, we eat a lot of our meals outside almost all year long, except of course when it's freezing cold outside. But we wanted to be able to enjoy that amenity, and in order to do that we knew we had to be conscious of fly control. So in addition to Lyle dragging the pastures, which breaks up the manure and helps it get back into the soil, we've established a program of biological fly control. We use fly predators, which eat the larvae of flies. It's sprinkled on fresh manure. We get shipments several times during the summer, and we sprinkle it on fresh manure, and then at that point they eat the fly larvae. They're very, very tiny little flying insect, and you never see them except out in the arena.